Good morning, everybody. Since we had an introduction of Tom Graham yesterday, I can say in two senses he needs no introduction. With that, we'll pass the floor to the usual format of about 45 minutes of a presentation and then open and lively discussion.
Good morning. I was hoping you would repeat that introduction since I enjoyed it so much yesterday. I would have appreciated hearing it one more time. As Michael mentioned yesterday, I have completed a book that's supposed to come out in October of this year. The title of it is Getting Russia Right. If it's translated into Russian, if I eliminate a chapter on Putin and the epilogue has some nasty things about Putin, maybe they will. I have suggested that the proper Russian title for the book will be Как Россию умом понять. So we'll see if they actually do publish it under that title. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the foundations of U.S.-Russia policy. And this draws very heavily on the first chapter in the book. And so where I want to start is to take us back to the early months of 1992 and pretend that you're sitting in Washington and consider how you would look at the situation in the former Soviet space. Cold War was over. Actually, it ended in 1989, but the Soviet Union had broken up at the very end of 1991. And it's only in early 1992 that President George H.W. Bush gets up and says that we won the Cold War. We've come out on top. We are the world's leading power. But the question that remained for the administration at that point is what we were going to do with the former Soviet space, and in particular, what you were going to do with Russia. Russia at that time was in a state of tremendous disarray. You saw at the governmental level, the economy was imploding, inflation was soaring, there were food shortages throughout the country. In fact, one of the first things the United States did in the post-Soviet period was send chicken legs to Russia to help feed the population. They became known as noshki busha, very popular at that point. So we had a country in disarray, but we also recognized that this was potentially a very powerful country on the global stage. Even after the breakup, Russia remained by far the largest country in the world, spanning 11 time zones, in the very heart of Eurasia. It had all those attributes that we talked about yesterday. The richest endowment of natural resources, one of the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. Russia managed to get the Soviet Union's permanent veto-wielding seat on the UN Security Council. And it was also a country that, by its mindset, by its traditions, thought of itself as a great power and clearly sent the message that it intended to return to playing a large role on the global stage as quickly as possible. At the same time, it was very uncertain what the political future of Russia was going to look like. On the one hand, you had Yeltsin at the head of the country as president, and this is a person that played a leading role in breaking up the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, 1990s. This was an individual who claimed to be a democratic leader, and in fact had been elected in probably some of the freest and fairest elections that we've ever seen in Russia. As president, initially to the Congress, the USSR Congress of People's Deputies, then the Russian Congress of People's Deputy, and finally the Russian presidency in 1991. He had brought on board a group of what were called the radical young reformers, who were in the process of instituting a series of radical economic reforms that were going to move, the hope was, Russia rapidly towards a free market economy. But at the same time, you still had within the Congress of People's Deputies a large number of unreconstructed communist, very rabid nationalist, and there was a major battle going on between the Congress of People's Deputies and the Yeltsin presidency at this point. There were also concerns in Washington about spreading anarchy, not only in Russia, but across the whole former Soviet space, thinking by analogy as to what happened with the breakup of Yugoslavia just a short time earlier. And nobody wanted that to happen in a country with the tens or thousands of nuclear weapons and such a large territory. And in addition, there was always this concern about where Russia would tend over the longer term, thinking about Russian traditions, Russian imperialism, and so forth. And so the question was, given this Russia, what was the policy going to be? How are you going to build relations with this country, not only in the near term, but hopefully over the longer term? And the formula that the Bush administration ultimately worked out in the early months of 1991 was a framework that consisted of 3 or 4 parts. First, at the top of the list was the goal of anchoring Russia in the Euro-Atlantic community as a free market democracy. That was supposed to be the headline goal of the United States at that time. But we also realized that we were going to need hedges against anarchy and recidivism on the Russian part. And the hedge came in 2 parts. One was on the nuclear side, arms control agreements that would give us some guarantee about the safety and control of this vast Soviet arsenal that was now spread across 4 countries in the former Soviet space. And the second element was the fostering of what became known as geopolitical pluralism in Eurasia. That is, supporting the independence of those Eastern European countries that had broken away from the Soviet bloc in 1989, 1990, but also supporting the territorial integrity and sovereignty and independence of all the new countries that emerged out of the Soviet Union. Now, we did this with a great deal of confidence at that point because the United States was the sole remaining superpower, as we like to say, at that time. Russia was weak, in no position really to resist the United States at that point. And there was no great power competitor looming on the horizon. This was long before China had emerged as a significant global player. Remember, as we mentioned yesterday, at that time, the Chinese economy was roughly the size of the Russian economy, and the Russian economy was imploding. So the United States had a great deal of confidence that it would be able to put in place this policy, and it would be able to do what it wanted to do with Russia, even if from time to time there were certain objections on the Russian part. The Russians simply weren't in a position to resist what the United States was going to do at this point. And this is the framework that the Bush administration put into place. They actually had very little time to act on it because by the time they had developed the framework, the president himself was engaged in a re-election campaign, turned his attention away from his victory in the Cold War, building a Cold War peace, and focused on domestic issues as he tried to get re-elected and ultimately failed in that goal. But what he did do was provide a framework for U.S.-Russian relations that was then pursued with greater or less enthusiasm and zeal by the 3 succeeding administrations, by President Clinton, his son George W. Bush, and then finally Obama. And if you look back over that period after the end of the Cold War to the Russian seizure of Crimea in 2014, you had 3 presidencies that basically traveled the same trajectory in relations with Russia during their terms. They all applied the framework, as I said. They were all aimed at anchoring Russia in the Euro-Atlantic community. They all began with great expectations for what could be accomplished in U.S.-Russian relations, and they all ended with great disappointment at the failure to do that. Each administration leaving the relationship with Russia in many ways in worse shape than when they found it upon coming into office. So if you look at the Clinton administration talked about building a strategic alliance with Russian reform. The Bush 43 administration was going to build a qualitatively new relationship with Russia that would move beyond the Cold War. And then the Obama administration talked about a reset, which was really to reset the relationship back to the beginning of the Clinton administration, back to the beginning of the Bush administration, where we were going to build this positive relationship with Russia. All three administrations also saw what they would call democratic backsliding in Russia during their terms, but it's something that they soft-pedaled, in part because they wanted to maintain this image of a democratic partnership with Russia as a fundamental part of U.S. policy. The administrations had probably their biggest successes in the areas of arms control. All worked in this area to one extent or another. The Clinton administration played an instrumental role in ensuring that Ukraine ultimately gave up its nuclear weapons, transferred them back to Russia for dismantlement. They also moved very aggressively on the non-Lugar program that started in the previous administration, but it really gathered steam during the Clinton administration. And this was a program that was focused on ensuring the safety and security of Russian nuclear weapons, other weapons of mass destruction. The Bush administration signs the Moscow Treaty on nuclear arms control, which reduces the number of strategically deployed weapons in both countries by roughly 2/3, from around 6,000 weapons down to 1,700 to 2,200 weapons. And of course, the Obama administration concludes the New START agreement, which lowers the upper limits on nuclear weapons to 1,550. So all three administrations make significant progress in that area. The relationship basically begins to come undone over geopolitical differences. For the Clinton administration, the differences emerge most clearly in the Balkans. Not so much with the conflict over Bosnia, something that we handled quite deftly at that time, but in the conflict over Kosovo in 1999, where we come at loggerheads with the Russians over how we're going to deal with that problem. The Russians concerned about the role they're going to play in Kosovo post-conflict, and actually marched a small military unit from their peacekeeping force to Bosnia to the airport in Pristina in Kosovo in order to lay a very firm claim to the fact that they were going to have to play a role in any sort of post-conflict settlement in Kosovo. The Bush administration's geopolitical challenge is largely in the former Soviet space. It starts with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, but obviously most dramatically in the short war, Russo-Georgian War in 2008. And then finally, for the Obama administration, the geopolitical clash comes first in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, where we're on opposite sides with the Russians, and then most dramatically in the events following the Maidan Revolution, 2004, so the siege of Crimea and the fomenting of rebellion in the eastern provinces of Ukraine. Now, in many ways, I think these were, well, fundamentally they were geopolitical clashes, but that's not the way they were perceived in Washington. If you look at what was happening in Kosovo, in the former Soviet space during the Bush administration, the Arab Spring, for the United States, these were all conflicts about the promotion of democracy. Countries moving against dictatorial regimes to take part of the wave of democracy that we thought was sweeping the world in the 1990s and into the 2000s. And we saw Russian opposition to what we were trying to do as not fundamentally grounded in Russian geopolitical concerns, but in the internal changes that were taking place in Russia, the backsliding on democracy, the move towards more authoritarian rule. And so the fundamental confrontation is not geopolitical, it becomes ideological, it's over values. And that is ultimately what undoes the relationship, both for the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration. Now, I think the question that I want to address, that we should ask, is why does the administration decide to move down this route? Why integration of Russia? Why the effort to build a democratic partnership? And why did the Bush administration and the Obama administration adopt this framework, despite the fact that the predecessors had failed in doing this? Okay, so I think there are two fundamental reasons why we took this route. The first is that democracy promotion is basically what the United States has done in the world from the moment it emerged as an independent republic back at the end of the 18th century. We did it in various ways. During the first century of American independence, it's largely through example, by building that gleaming or shining city on the hill that others would want to emulate. In the post-World War II, post-Cold War period, there's more of a direct effort to promote democracy in various parts of the world. And there was a certain exuberance and hubris that comes after the end of the Cold War, in part because we had won that Cold War. So this titanic struggle of the 20th century that was largely ideological had ended with liberal democracy, the American system, having defeated fascism during the Second World War, and then less than a half century later, defeating communism. A very famous article by Francis Fukuyama appears at this point, The End of History. The idea that what the 20th century had demonstrated was that the only viable form of national existence was liberal democracy. It didn't mean that countries were going to become liberal democracies overnight, but it was clear that the only way to survive and thrive going into the 21st century was by building liberal, democratic, free market economies. And so that was a driving force for the United States. This idea that liberal democracy was the way forward was reinforced by certain other events in the world. Globalization was just getting off the ground at that point. And globalization was very much a reflection or an extension of what the United States was doing. After all, we're the people that invented globalization. It's based on the interconnectedness of markets, the information revolution that we were driving at this point. And so globalization is also pushing all countries towards a certain set of operating procedures if they're going to thrive in the 21st century. And you add on top of that, what was called the third wave of democracy that had begun in in Europe in the 1970s, the revolutions in Portugal, for example, had swept through Latin America in the 1980s, and now had advanced in Eastern Europe with the year of the revolutions of 1989, and now finally into the Soviet Union. So you take all these things together, and you have sufficient reason to believe that liberal democracy is the way to go, and that Russia has very little choice but to move down that path. It is going to revive itself as a significant global power. I think the second reason that we pushed for integration or democratic partnership is actually psychological. And that is that the United States wanted to convince itself that it had actually won a victory in the Cold War. And what is victory in war? Victory in war comes not when you defeat the enemy's armies. Victory comes finally when the enemy adopts your own political system. And so having Russia become a liberal democracy would have been a tremendous vindication of the American system, and would have also secured the place of whichever president was in office when you could actually say that this had been accomplished. It secured his place in American history. So the psychological component, I think, was also a driving factor behind this. Each of the three presidents' desire to build a democratic partnership with Russia. Now, everybody recognized that doing this with Russia still was going to be a formidable task. I mean, Russia, after all, had a long history of autocracy, did not have a great deal of experience in democratic practices. But there were, again, two reasons why the United States thought that nevertheless it was possible to make progress in this area. The first was that the United States thought that it had the theoretical tools that it needed in order to move countries like Russia away from a totalitarian system to a democratic system. Some of the older people in the room will remember the whole field of transitology that developed in the 1990s. We had masses of scholars who were working on developing the theory of how you move from totalitarian authoritarianism to a democratic society. And now all of a sudden they had dozens of countries in which they could practice this theory. On the economic side, the United States had played a significant role in overcoming the debt crisis in Latin America at that point in the 1980s, and believed they had developed a set of policies that provided the way you move from a state-controlled economy to a free market economy. These were largely codified in something that became known as the Washington Consensus on private property, among other things, but a whole set of market principles that you had to put in place in order to lay the foundation for a modern economic system. And so we take the Washington Consensus and transitology, and now we've got the intellectual tools that we can apply to this problem in Russia. At the same time, we thought that we had material that we could work with in Russia, that there were, in fact, leaders that were committed to democratic reform. Yeltsin we've already talked about, but clearly was a larger-than-life figure in Russia in the 1990s, someone who by his actions appeared to be committed to democratic practices, talked about democracy a lot at that time, and developed a very close working relationship with President Clinton. Yeltsin surrounded himself with a bunch of younger officials who also appeared committed to at least free market reform, perhaps to a somewhat lesser extent democracy at that point. So we had a leadership that we thought we could work with. For President Bush, it was a bit more challenging because Putin had become president at that point. Everybody was aware of his KGB background at that time. That raised some concerns. Putin, in his initial time in office, took some steps to restore order in Russia that looked like steps towards authoritarianism. But you could excuse those as an effort to build an authoritative state on the ruins of the Russian state that coming out of the 1990s. And President Bush thought that by embracing Putin, that he could move him in a democratic direction. And so there were some doubts about Putin, but not nearly as deep as you would have thought at that time. And then finally, with President Obama, you got a young president, Medvedev at that time, who appeared committed to democracy, talked about the need to build an innovation society in Russia that had to be grounded in a more open political system. Of course, Obama's problem was that Medvedev wasn't really the guy that was calling the shots at that point, but it was nevertheless the Russian president, and this could allow you to present the partnership as one that was based in democratic values. And then there's one final element, I think, that helps explain why Bush and Obama continued to try to build a democratic partnership or present the relationship with Russia as one that was grounded in a fundamental commitment to democracy, despite the fact that the previous president had failed in that regard. And that has to do with the way we thought about building elite and public support for a closer working relationship with Russia. The argument, I think, inside the administration was that you won't be able to build that type of support unless you can present Russia as a democracy. The United States does not forge long-term alliances or relationships with major powers that aren't fundamentally democratic in orientation, that there's a set of shared values that lies at the foundation of that alliance. It can't simply be shared geopolitical interest. And so there was an urge, even as Russia was moving in the opposite direction, either to soft pedal it, downplay it, the authoritarian elements, highlight what you thought was movement towards democracy as a way of maintaining the image of a democratic partnership with Russia. And of course, the relationship ultimately collapses when the gap between Russian reality and your rhetoric can no longer be supported. So that, I think, those are the fundamental reasons why we went down this path. Now, as I said, there were also significant hedges, and the hedges became increasingly important as the relationship moved forward. I think from the Russian standpoint, the hedges began to dominate the way they thought the United States was conducting its policy. So the rhetoric was democratic partnership with Russia. From the Russian standpoint, what was really important were the hedges that were meant to constrain Russia in some way. Three hedges that I'll talk about briefly. First was in the area of arms control. Let me back up just a minute here when we talk about the hedges. The United States did not hide the fact that it was engaging in these hedges because it was concerned about Russia's future trajectory. We were worried about its return to its imperialist traditions. We were worried about the breakdown in democratic politics in Russia. But we've tried to present the hedges as part of a larger effort to build a Europe whole and free, as George H.W. Bush said way back at the end of the Cold War, and that Europe whole and free would include Russia. And so the argument that we made to the Russians is that we were actually doing things that were in Russia's interest if Russia construed its interest properly. Again, another example of American hubris. We always conveyed to the Russians that we understood better what their interests are than they might at any one moment. And so the hedges were intended, yes, as a hedge against Russian recidivism, anarchy in the former Soviet space, but nevertheless, in the long term, were also intended to help Russia anchor itself in the Euro-Atlantic community. Now, with the arms control, we actually worked quite well with the Russians. This was a hedge that the Russians also appreciated for a couple of reasons. One is that our policy made Russia the sole owner of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. We worked very hard to make sure that the strategic nuclear weapons that had ended up in Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine with the breakup of the Soviet Union were returned to Russia. As I said already, the hardest one was with Ukraine at that point. But we put the pressure on the Ukrainians that was necessary to persuade them to give up those nuclear weapons, then signed the Budapest Memorandum, which a lot of people talk about now, that provided security assurances by the United States, the Great Britain, and Russia. At that time, obviously the Russians violated those assurances in 2014 and most grossly in 2022. But nevertheless, we were doing something that the Russians thought was helpful to them at that point. The Bush administration and the Obama administrations negotiated strategic arms control deals with Russia. It was based on parity, both sides. This is the one area where Russia could sit down with the United States as a genuine equal and bargain hard to make sure that their interests were concerned, but it also allowed them to present themselves on the global stage as the other great nuclear power, and this played to Russian pride in particular. In fact, on the arms control side, what the Russians were really concerned about was not our willingness to negotiate arms controls with the Russians, but it was our willingness to walk away from arms control agreements that we thought no longer served our purpose. The most important of them being the ABM Treaty, which the Bush administration withdrew from in 2002, something that the Russians had considered a cornerstone of strategic stability. And despite the fact that the United States tried to justify this as a response to the nuclear programs of what we called rogue regimes at that time, North Korea and Iran, in particular, the Russians saw this as a direct threat to the Russian strategic arsenal, if not immediately, then certainly over time. But in any event, by and large, the Russians were happy to work with us on arms control agreements. It became an entirely different thing when we got to the next hedge, which was NATO expansion. I don't want to go into all the history of whether we had told the Russians that we wouldn't expand NATO eastward or not. Mary Serrati has a wonderful book on it, Not 1 Inch, that you all should read if you haven't read it already. But I think, the Clinton administration fairly early on decided that it was going to expand NATO eastward. They knew that Russia would be opposed, and that they would have to do or take some steps to mollify the Russians. And they did this in a number of ways. First was to talk about NATO in a different way. Throughout the Cold War, the focus really was on containing the Soviet Union. In 1992, 1993, we rediscovered and highlighted another reason that NATO had been formed back in the 1940s. It wasn't only directed against the Soviet Union. A fundamental reason for the founding of NATO was to reduce the risk of interstate war in Europe. We wanted to reconcile, in particular, the French and the Germans that had fought two world wars in the 20th century. And so we rediscovered that with respect to Eastern Europe. And indeed, after the breakup of the Soviet bloc, the demise of the Soviet Union, you began to see some of the tensions that had led to a conflict in Eastern Europe during the 20th century and earlier begin to reemerge. So we were going to expand NATO eastward, not because we wanted to contain Russia, but because we wanted to stabilize the geopolitical situation in Eastern Europe. At the same time, we began to emphasize less the military aspects of NATO and more the political aspects of NATO as an alliance. Membership would be open to Eastern European countries that moved in a democratic direction. So democracy became a defining element of NATO membership, a political element to the organization. We also began to talk more about out-of-area operations. So we weren't going to use NATO to defend ourselves against Russia, but to deal with the other types of threats that might emerge to Europe elsewhere in the world, the Balkans in particular in the 1990s. And then finally, in the 1990s, we also substantially reduced the American military presence in Europe from over 300,000 troops at the end of the Cold War to slightly over 100,000 by 1995. Again, all as part of an effort to ease some of the Russian concerns about NATO. And then finally, as we moved towards the first steps towards actual expansion, we signed the founding act, NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997. And that act contains two important elements that were to reassure Russia about NATO's intentions going forward. The first were what we called the three no's, which stated that the United States or NATO had no intention, no plans, and no reason to put nuclear infrastructure into new member states. We also declared that get this phrase exactly, it was very carefully phrased, but in the current geopolitical circumstances, NATO saw no need to permanently station substantial combat forces in new member states. So there wouldn't be a large NATO military presence in the new member states. And the Founding Act also set up a permanent joint council, which brought Russia together with NATO members to sit down and discuss various aspects of NATO policy, European security. And the idea was that we would give Russia some insight into the inner workings of NATO. As the rhetoric at the time, we would give the Russians a voice in NATO discussions, but no veto over NATO decisions. That council was reformatted as the NATO-Russia Council in 2002 in a slightly different structure where Russia sat down with the NATO countries individually in their national capacities. So it wasn't whatever the number of NATO members had, 19 plus 1, but 20 countries meeting together to discuss issues. Now, this did mollify the Russians to a great extent. There were tremendous objections on the Russian side, but I think the administration had calculated correctly that Russia was in no position to push back in a very forceful fashion against those first two waves of NATO expansion. It's only when the United States begins to push for expansion to Georgia and Ukraine in 2008 that we begin to see greater resistance on the Russian part. The economic recovery under Putin, rebuilding of some of Russia's military capacity, gave it the confidence that it could use military force against Georgia in 2008 to derail whatever ambitions Georgia might have to join NATO. And that continues, obviously, with Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. So NATO expansion becomes a significant problem in the relationship. The third hedge is the effort to promote geopolitical pluralism directly in the former Soviet space. This is a problem that wasn't that much of an issue in the relationship in the Clinton administration, in part because the Clinton administration was clearly focused on Russia as its own priority in the former Soviet space. And while it did a few things to support the territorial integrity and independence of the other former Soviet states, it really paled in comparison to the effort we were making with Russia at that time. The former Soviet space becomes a real problem in the relationship during the Bush administration. What we would say at that time is that the problems we had in the former Soviet space poisoned the entire relationship. But Bush, from the very beginning, decided to be much more aggressive in the way the United States promoted American interest in that region. We took over what the Clinton administration was doing on Caspian energy and really ramped it up, so that by 2005, 2006, we had, with our allies, with the commercial partners, had opened up an oil pipeline out of the Caspian region and a gas pipeline out of the Caspian region that circumvented Russian territory. We did this for two reasons. One was to help break or reduce the Russian dominance of energy markets, particularly in Eastern Europe, by giving the East Europeans an alternative. But we also did that because it enhanced the sovereignty of Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia, because they didn't have to depend on Russia to get their product to global markets or into European markets. The Bush administration also was very aggressive in the way we built our military presence in Central Asia at that point. Now, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, we had pushed very energetically to open up military access through Central Asia, bases in Uzbekistan and in Kyrgyzstan at that point. We did this with support from Russia. In fact, President Putin had overruled his own security officers or security officials in agreeing to facilitate the opening of those bases. We always thought that we could have done it even without Russian facilitation by talking directly to the Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz, but the Russians thought, nevertheless, the Russians played a helpful role at that point. We had led the Russians to believe in 2001 that we would maintain those bases in Afghanistan for 2 years, maybe a little bit longer. Gives you an idea of how quick we thought we would settle the conflict in Afghanistan. It didn't turn out quite that way. But as we got settled in Central Asia, in those bases, we also began to see the strategic advantage of keeping those bases over the long term, not only with regard to the conflict in Afghanistan itself, but the way it positioned us to deal with Chinese influence in Central Asia, but also giving us insight to what was happening in the western reaches of China, and also giving us greater insight into what was happening in Siberia. So the Central Asian bases became a point of contention between us and the Russians, starting in 2004, 2005. The United States was also very actively supportive of a regional organization that was called Guam, or Guam, Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova. Uzbekistan joined for a very brief period. But we saw this as something of a counterweight to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which was a Russian-dominated organization that basically made Russia the guarantor of security in Eurasia. But the biggest problem in the relationship turned out, not surprisingly, to be Ukraine. We can go through the reasons why Ukraine is so important to Russia, for geopolitical reasons, for psychological reasons, and so forth. But the United States clearly, under the Bush administration, believed that a independent Ukraine was strongly in America's interest. We bought into what Zbigniew Brzezinski was saying about Russia and Ukraine. If I can paraphrase, it's basically that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. With Ukraine subordinated, it becomes an empire and therefore a threat to the United States. And that is a view that permeated the upper levels of the Bush administration. So while we would argue that we hadn't instigated the Orange Revolution, I don't think that we did. We were clearly happy by the results of the Orange Revolution and played a role in trying to enhance the status of the Ukrainian leadership that came in as a result of the Orange Revolution, giving preference to the Ukrainians over Russia, for example, in World Trade Organization negotiations, and some other in some other ways, and that became a real sore point for their relationship, in particular in 2008 when we make the push to bring Ukraine into NATO. So, as I said, from the Russian standpoint, these hedges became really the driving or essential element of Russian foreign policy, despite the fact that the administration was still talking about democratic partnership with Russia. 2014, the seizure of Crimea really brings to an end this period in U.S.-Russian relations. It's the end of the effort to integrate Russia into the Euro-Atlantic community, and the beginning of a process in the second half of the Obama administration, pursued through Trump and into the Biden administration, of gradually building up a policy to contain Russia. Very loose containment during the Obama administration, in part because there were still a couple of things that we wanted to do with the Russians. Iranian nuclear weapons, for example. We wanted Russian assistance in dealing with the emergence of ISIS in Syria at that time. And so while we do what we normally do when we're annoyed by the Russians, which is no more business as usual, reduce diplomatic contacts to a minimum, there was still a need to work with the Russians to help advance a couple of American interests in the Middle East. By the time we get to the Trump administration, those have largely fallen by the wayside. The Trump administration withdraws from the nuclear agreement with the Iranians. ISIS becomes less of a problem in the Middle East. The president himself, Trump, talks about building a good relationship with Russia, but if you actually look at what the administration's policy is, it's a continuation, a hardening of the Obama administration's policy. More sanctions, less diplomatic contact, and then finally we get to the Biden administration, which upon coming to office makes two things quite clear. One, that it has no intention of resetting relations with Russia, and second, that Russia is not going to be a priority for the Biden administration. It wants to build a workable relationship with the Russians and then park the relationship so that it can focus its attention on dealing with what it sees as a real strategic challenge to the United States, and that is China. It didn't quite work out that way, even after the summit meeting between the two presidents in Geneva of June of 2021, if I get my dates correctly. By that time, by the fall of 2021, we're dealing again with the Russian buildup of troops along the border with Ukraine. The Russians release two draft treaties on security guarantees, one that will be signed with NATO, one with the United States, that lays out in particular its concerns about NATO expansion. We have a brief period of negotiation in January and into February, and that all ends with the Russian invasion or reinvasion of Ukraine on February 24th. And from there, the relationship goes downhill, ends up where we are. What happens next is what we talked about yesterday. And so I'll end there.